Paganism has consistently been a savage, demonic influence. And I chose those words very intentionally. It demeans people. It destroys people. The rise of paganism, the specter of paganism amongst us leads to savage behavior of human beings towards one another. It's driven by demons. And if you remove Christianity from the public square and the public school and the public university, and you replace it with a fancier label, but beneath the labeling, paganism, savagery will emerge. We see it on our college campuses. Throughout history, the labels have changed, the names of the gods have been different, but paganism has consistently led to the offering of our children as sacrifices to appease those demonic idols. Gee, that couldn't happen in the 21st century. I mean, other than the 3,000 or so children a day that we're sacrificing right now. Christianity, as it emerged and wherever it has taken root, has changed the way that human beings were valued. Christianity has established boundaries for persons, for families, for society. It isn't just a theology that flourishes in the midst of a service on a weekend in a special building on a special location. The spread of Christianity has consistently across history improved human condition. Now, for full disclosure, it's never been without fault or flaw. Human beings are involved, and therefore you can find some glaring weaknesses at about just any chapter of history you want to open. I'm not arguing that Christians are perfect, nor the story of Christianity is. But I would argue that the value we have brought to every human life, the elevation of the treatment of women, the elevation of the treatment of children, the moral authority for the abolition of slavery, all of those things came from a Judeo-Christian ethic. So we turn on the Olympics and men are boxing with women. I hope you're spiritually aware enough to understand that's not an Olympic decision. That's not an international decision. That is a spiritual value being played out in front of you. A Christian worldview conveys principles which shape our lives and the society in which we live. We don't always live up to the standards, but the sense of right and wrong, our sense of justice, calls us to strive to grow until we do. If we ignore the principles of Christian life or we seek to redefine them to allow us to continue our deviation from the truth, what we are in essence doing is walking away from our faith. We're not allowed to redefine it. Tragically, and I say that because it is a tragedy that's unfolding before us, we are witnessing a tremendous movement away from a Christian worldview. And in many cases, the voices encouraging this apostasy are coming from within the established church. People who sit in churches are casually affiliated with the Christian faith, and they hardly notice as they are herded into the principles of paganism. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future, folks. I'm not talking about the book of Revelation. It's happening today in large numbers. The lack of familiarity with Scripture and the lack of interest in honoring God are fueling this change. So the outcome of all of this is that we awaken somewhat from our sleepwalk into the darkness and find ourselves in a place that scarcely resembles Christianity. In the language of the Apostle Paul, we have a form of godliness, but we deny its power. You should know, we should remind one another, this has not always been our story. We are a people with a Christian heritage. It has deeply shaped the unfolding story of this nation. I'm not arguing that God is an American or that He speaks English. That's nonsense. This just happens to be the place God planted me. I would find the stories of faith wherever God planted me if I were trying to encourage the people. But in the early 1900s, I've told this story before, but I did a little more work on it, and I think it's worth repeating a portion of it. You see, there were times in our history where Christianity was far more a part of the public discussion. There was a time when the primary means of communicating the news was the published newspaper, and the habit in that season, at the peak of the newspaper's influence, was on Monday morning, the sermon from the leading pulpits in the city would be published on the front page of the newspaper. That's hard to imagine, isn't it? Well, in the 1900s, there was a 16-year-old young man by the name of William Borden who graduated from a Chicago high school. He was heir to the Borden fortune. Before he began his Ivy League education at Yale, his parents sent him on a trip around the world as a graduation present. Well, he had come to Christ through the ministry of D.L. Moody before he began that trip. And while he was circumnavigating the world, something happened that no one expected. As he traveled through Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, he felt a growing burden for the world's hurting people. So he wrote a letter to his parents and informed them that he wanted to spend the remainder of his life being a missionary. When the news spread, one of his friends remarked that he would be throwing his life away as a missionary. When he returned from his trip, he went to Yale University and he graduated, and then he studied and graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary. When he'd finished his Ivy League education, he boarded a ship for China to serve as a missionary. Due to the passion to reach the Muslim people, he stopped in Egypt to learn the Arabic language, and while he was in Egypt, the 25-year-old Borden contracted spinal meningitis. Within a month, he was dead. When the news of Borden's death was cabled back to the U.S., nearly every major American newspaper reported on it. Imagine that, reporting the journey of a missionary. As is stated in his biography, a wave of sorrow went around the world. He not only gave up his fortune, but himself to be a missionary. Borden had walked away from his wealthy fortune to take the gospel of Jesus to the nations of the world. Most regarded as a tragedy. However, God took the tragedy and did something far greater than Borden could have ever done himself. Thousands of young men and women heard his story in the newspapers of America, and it inspired them to leave the courses they had chosen and give their lives to reach the nations of the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, I hope that for decades, the United States led the mission movement to the world. And it wasn't primarily a denominational exercise or the lunatic fringe. They were oftentimes the young men and women from the finest families in our communities. There was a time when parents had aspirations that their children, the highest achievement they could imagine for their children would be they would serve the Lord. Well, when Borden's parents were given his Bible, they found the following in his Bible. Just after he'd renounced his fortune to go do missions work, he wrote the words, "No reserves." His father had told him he would always have a job in his company, but at a later point, he told him he would never let him work in the company again. At that time, Borden wrote two more words in his Bible, "No retreat." And they discovered in his Bible, when his mother found it, she went to collect the body, two more words written shortly before his death in Egypt, "No regret." So his legacy became no reserve, no retreat, and no regret. See, Christianity is intended to be something more than a public service that we visit occasionally. It's a transformational influence in our lives. And if we don't like the condition of our culture or the value that's being attached to children or to marriage or to families or to a whole host of other values that we had considered to be a fat part of the fabric of the culture where we lived, the problem isn't the ungodly, it's that those of us that imagine ourselves to be Christians have taken those values and treated them so shabbily that they're no longer held up in the public square. So this whole question of Christian or pagan, and I'm almost back to your notes. There's hope, there's hope. It's fleeting, but there is hope. Again, we are witnesses to the rapid movement away from a Christian worldview. In the plainest of language, it would be a descent into paganism. If it continues, I assure you, the world in which we live, our cities, our schools, and our universities will become increasingly savage places. We maintain a form of Christian tradition, but we increasingly deny the power of our faith. A Christian worldview conveys principles which shape our lives and the society in which we live. Let me give you an example, not intentionally desiring to offend anyone. If we take the topic of marriage, it gets a lot of discussion these days. It isn't an idea that began with our government or begins with us. It didn't begin with social media or bridal magazines. In Genesis chapter 2, which is very near the beginning of the book, it says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." In Matthew 19, Jesus picks up the idea. He said, "Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator," Jesus believed in a Creator God. Oh, by the way, God made them male and female. Jesus established the categories, folks. I'm willing to count him as an authoritative voice. And he said, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, so that they're no longer two but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." Jesus is quoting from the Hebrew Bible, but he's pulled it into the New Testament, so it's not some idea from antiquity. It made it into the message that Jesus delivered to the world. It's still authoritative. In 1996, the idea of marriage had come under enough assault that there was a movement that it be institutionalized in our nation again. It hadn't seemed necessary to institutionalize it prior to that. It was so much a part of the fabric of how we lived. There weren't serious challenges to the concept. But there were enough serious challenges, and the churches had failed to the extent that we were looking to the government to codify something that clearly is a biblical principle. It's not a political idea. So in 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act, it's a federal law in the United States, was passed by the 104th United States Congress and signed into law by President Bill Clinton. No irony in that. The Defense of Marriage Act banned federal recognition of same-sex marriage by limiting the definition of marriage to the union of one man and one woman. And it further allowed states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriages granted under the laws of other states. That was 1996. That's not ancient history. We had electricity and indoor plumbing, amazing conveniences in 96. Well, in 2022, the Respect for Marriage Act was passed by a 61-36 vote in our Senate. Before final passage, the Senate rejected 3 amendments to protect religious freedom proposed by Senators Rubio, Lankford, and Lee. Utah Senator Mike Lee urged his 12 Republican colleagues who voted for the act to reverse course and add a proposed amendment to the bill, but the amendment failed by a vote of 48 to 49. What you may not remember is that the Respect for Marriage Act, language can be so manipulative. The Respect for Marriage Act not only repealed the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act, but it also obliges those, and I quote, acting under the color of state law, end quote, to recognize same-sex marriages. In the time all that was happening, churches had very little to say, and candidly, they've had very little to say since then. But long before it was voted on in Congress, again, marriage is a biblical idea. It's a spiritual principle. A man and a woman making a covenant in the sight of God for inviting God's blessing upon their union and the remainder of their days. How did we get to a place where it needed to be institutionalized as a law? And how did we rapidly move to a place where we would no longer even allow a law that honored a biblical worldview to stay in place in our nation? Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. You know the drill. Hit the bell for notifications. If you want to, leave a comment.